everyone. Welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. In chapter 11, there's one thing in particular I want to talk about because I think it's really interesting and really important for the wider understanding of who Jesus is and how Jesus understands his own mission. But there's quite a bit in this chapter, so I'll go through some of it pretty quickly and then we'll circle back and we'll catch that main bit. So chapter 11 begins with Luke's edition of what we often call the Lord's Prayer. The prayer that we recite and that we recite in church in Ellen is from the book of Matthew. And this prayer is very, very similar, and you can see that it comes from the same sort of teaching. It says, Father, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, give us each day our daily bread. A lot of the same things, but it is a bit shorter. It was common for rabbis and for teachers to instruct their disciples on how to pray. And so it's natural for them to ask and for him to teach. But then he goes on and speaks about why God might give us what we ask for. And that's a really interesting sort of philosophical thing that he gets into that I'm not quite sure I understand fully, but it's there for you to read if you're interested in that. A lot about giving good gifts, but also a kind of bit about persistence. Then Jesus gets into a bit of a logical quandary with some people who are saying that he's doing miracles and he's driving out demons by the power of Satan or Beelzebul or Beelzebub. There's lots of different names for this sort of character that they had in the ancient world, the Satan kind of character. And his logic is basically, why would Satan do this? Because Satan's only hurting himself. So logically, that's just stupid because Satan wouldn't do this to himself, driving out his own demons. And so he sort of defeats that, but then has some other stuff about it. Then there's the sign of Jonah, which is the bit I will get back to. He's got some other sayings and phrases and ends kind of with this back and forth battle with the Pharisees and the experts in the law, or the NRSV calls them lawyers. And I think this is definitely an interesting thing. You can see, again, the anger he's stirring up that ends up getting him killed between the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. He makes them very angry. He frustrates them because he basically is tearing down their privilege. He's tearing down everything that they have that makes them special, and the gatekeeping that they do between the people and God, and the people and knowledge. And he does not abide by that gatekeeping, and so he tears it down. So to loop back a bit to the sign of Jonah there in verse 29 all the way through verse 32, the sign of Jonah is a passage that also appears, hey James, in the book of Matthew. And this is a really interesting thing where Jesus references this small book in the Old Testament that is about Jonah. It's a story we know really well. We tell the beginning of the book of Jonah to children often, that Jonah is a prophet who is sent to the Gentile town of Nineveh, but he doesn't want to go. And so he flees the other direction, ends up on a boat. There's a massive storm. The people throw him overboard at his own behest because he knows that it's God. He's swallowed up by a great fish and spat out on the shore. Basically the sign that he needs to go to Nineveh and preach to them. And so he does. And when he does, they repent and they give themselves over. But then the next part of the sign of Jonah is really interesting, is that and often the sign of Jonah has been interpreted by different people who've read the Bible as a sign of Jesus's death and then time in the tomb before he's resurrected. So Jonah spends obviously 3 days in the tomb, or in the belly of the fish. And so then Jesus would spend that. And so people say, well, the sign of Jonah is Jesus's time in the tomb. And I don't totally exclude that interpretation, but the way that I read the crux of Jonah is not his time in the belly of the fish, but it is that the people of Nineveh repent, and then Jonah, as the Israelite prophet, is angry about that. And he's frustrated and he's mad at God over God allowing them to repent and welcoming them back. So in verse 32, Jesus says, the men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And now something greater than Jonah is here. So there's a question in the ministry of Jesus of how much Jesus's plan included the Gentiles, or actively included the Gentiles. There's different times where Jesus does again, actively include Gentile people, but there are other times where he talks about a sort of primacy of the people of Israel and the sort of firstborn people who are Israelites, who are Jews, who then they get sort of the kind of first dibs. He's going to them first before he goes to the Gentiles. But there's also some question about whether he really, or how much he intended that sort of Gentile mission. But the Apostle Paul takes up the Gentile mission really wholeheartedly. And so really a lot of that expansion of the Christian faith that comes out of this Jewish Messiah comes from the Apostle Paul more so than Jesus himself. And so sometimes people have said, well, Jesus had no intention of expansion to the Gentiles. And really, the idea of Christianity as an expansive missional religion comes from Paul. And that's not entirely true, because again, there are points where Jesus does welcome Gentiles. There's the Syrophoenician woman. There's his own pointing to, earlier in Luke, we talked about how he references Elisha and the widow of Zarephath and Naaman the Syrian, these other Gentiles from the Old Testament. And so this is right in line with that. He's talking about what happens in Jonah. Jonah goes to Gentiles, and Gentiles accept the message and repent, while the Jewish person in Jonah is angry about that and frustrated. So in my own interpretation of this, I think the sign of Jonah is that Gentiles and people who are not normally welcome receive the faith, they receive the message, and they welcome it, and that the people who are gatekeeping that message are angry about it and are frustrated. And we get that because right after this, he talks about a lamp, and you don't hide the lamp, you let it have light to see. And then he has the encounter with the Pharisees and the experts of the law, in which they are mad that he's tearing down their gatekeeping. So this, to me, is one of those places where it shows that Jesus did have an intention and did have a more wide and global reach for the expansion of his message and for the way that it would go out to all the world. I'm almost there. And so that, to me, is a massive point here in the book of Luke that I think we need to hang on to, is the sign of Jonah right there. So I think that is a really interesting point. I think it's a really interesting little nugget that we don't really pull out very much when we read the Gospel of Luke, because it's maybe hard to get into where that comes from. So thanks for watching. Thanks for joining us this evening, and catch us again next week for Luke chapter 12. Thanks, everyone.